Hello, everybody. My name is Russell Brooks, Associate Director for Executive Education and Online Learning at LSE. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the fifth and final webinar in our series on the theme of skills for a post-COVID-19 world as part of the LSE Festival this week. If you've been with us all week, then it's great to see you again, and congratulations on completing the box set. If you're with us for the first time today, then it's wonderful to have you with us. In this webinar series, we are considering the professional skills that you need for success in the post-COVID world, drawing on insights from the course conveners from LSE's online certificate courses. Each day, LSE faculty have been discussing research trends in their field, as well as practical ways to upskill your professional capabilities and how to meet the future challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for us all. At the end of each session, there's an opportunity for you to ask questions to the speaker. Whilst we wait for everyone to arrive, we'd love to hear where in the world you are joining us from today. Thanks to Bill from what he describes as a cold New York for starting us off, and hello to Dominique from Nova Scotia, who I recognise as having been with us for quite a few of the sessions this week as well. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. James Abdey, who will be talking to us on the topic of using data for effective decision-making. Data-driven decision-making and the ability to communicate a large amount of information to audiences effectively are vital in any industry. During this event, James will discuss the essentials for an analyst's statistical toolbox in a post-COVID world, with practical examples of how you can harness data. James Abdey is an assistant professorial lecturer in the Department of Statistics at LSE and is the course convener of LSE's online certificate course, Data Analysis for Management. His research interests include market research techniques and forensic statistics, the interplay of statistics and the law. Outside of academia, he has worked on various quantitative-based consultative projects in areas including the art market, the World Gold Council, and he's also delivered seminars at the UK Parliament. If you have any questions during the event that you'd like to ask James, then please do post your question in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the event. But without further ado, I will hand over to James.
Russell, thank you very much indeed for that very warm introduction, and happy Friday, everyone. And I can see that you are in various time zones around the world. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. And thank you very much for taking the time out to join us for this session. So let me just share my screen and we will make a start. So the title of the talk, goodness me, how to harness data to improve your decision-making and increase your probability of success. That is quite a mouthful. So let's try and perhaps break that down. Well, perhaps even before we look at that, your skills for the post-COVID world. A little over a year ago, I guess the term COVID-19 was alien to the vast majority of us. And yet now it's really impacting every aspect of our daily lives. Will we ever truly be in a post-COVID world? I will ask that question purely rhetorically. I think it's perhaps somewhat naive to suppose that COVID is just going to completely disappear anytime soon, and it may fall to sort of humanity to adapt to living and hopefully just sort of managing with COVID. So the topic of today, data. I mean, I am a statistician by trade, and clearly I love data in terms of being able to assist us with decision making. So let's perhaps break down the session title, how to harness data. Why do we need, indeed, to harness it? Well, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term big data. Now, there are various definitions I think we could offer for that, and I don't want to go heavy into definitions, but we can broadly think of big data in terms of, shall we say, the four V's, in that there is the sheer volume of data and the sheer velocity at which data are being collected. Fun fact, it's been estimated that perhaps in the last 2 or 3 years, we as in humanity, have probably collected more data digitally than in the rest of human history combined. And I think that's a staggering statistic to think about, such that for my LSE undergraduates in year one, when they embark on their 3-year degree, I think of them that by the time they graduate, the amount of data collected upon registration, that volume again could have been collected by the time they pass out with their degree and graduate. So there's no shortage of data out there. I think there is a critical shortage of people with the ability, the skill to sort of make sense of data. So we've got the volume, we've got the velocity, we have the variety of data. Data come in many different forms, structured and unstructured. So don't think necessarily that when you wish to undertake a data analytic project, that your data will already be nicely formatted, let's say in an Excel spreadsheet ready for analysis. There's also the value aspect, in that we can think of these vast data sets out there as containing value, but value which needs to be extracted. Now, I think it was The Economist some time ago postulated whether data is or are, call it a singular or plural noun, the new oil. And I thought it's an interesting analogy. And analogies are rarely perfect. I suppose, I mean, where there's a clear difference between oil and data is that oil is pretty much finite, and data for practical purposes we can think of as near infinite. So in that sense, quite a gulf between oil and data. But in terms of the value, does oil have value? Well, it depends. And spoiler alert, it depends is the classic LSE answer to all of life's questions, allegedly. Such that the crude oil, the stuff coming direct out of the ground, that itself doesn't really have value. It's only after that oil has been refined into aviation fuel, petrol, gasoline, whatever. It's only then that it truly has some value, albeit perhaps a move away from fossil fuels to green energy. But I think the analogy with data works very well with this idea of refinement, in that the raw data themselves is perhaps of limited value. It's only once we effectively process that data to analyze it, make sense of that data, then it truly becomes valuable, such that we convert data into information and ultimately insights to inform decision making. So the middle line of the session title, improve your decision making. We are all making decisions all of the time, some trivial, some life defining, to study or not to study, to invest or not to invest, to lock down or not to lock down. So regardless of what that decision is, the decision is made at the present moment in time, and the consequences of those decisions are typically realized in the future. Now, the thing about the future is that it hasn't happened yet, and so we are forever having to make decisions under uncertainty. And as any student of mine studying statistics would know, we will need to apply probabilities as a means of quantifying uncertainty, such that taking a data analytic approach to decision making does not guarantee success. There are no certainties in life other than allegedly, I think it's meant to be death and taxes. Everything else is uncertain. And so while we cannot eliminate uncertainty, we can at least try and quantify it to help improve our overall success rate, i.e. our overall probability of success. Now, my briefing for this session was to try and make this as interactive as possible. And clearly, with the wonders of Zoom webinar technology, there is some limitation to that. But, I wouldn't be a statistician if I didn't conduct a poll. And that is a Q alert for my poll activator. So I have set up a very small quantitative question for you, which should be on your screen at any moment now. And please do go ahead and answer the poll question. Okay, and well, there we go. So first of all, perhaps just a little bit of background to this. And I understand some people watching this on other platforms may not be seeing this poll question. So for the benefit of all, the question was to pick a number at random between 1 and 10. And we had a pretty healthy response rate. I'm not seeing exactly how many participants we have, but there are a reasonable number of responses. So everyone who participated in that poll did indeed correctly or provide an answer to that question. But if I focus on the phrase at random, so I think this question itself, I think no one could claim that this was controversial in any way. However, if you're seeing the results on screen, you can see the bias which exists. And I predicted, and my moderator Russell will confirm, no doubt, in the Q&A session, that I predicted 7 would be the answer which came up. In that, this goes to show that when human beings are making decisions, and clearly this was so uncontroversial, a number at random between 1 and 10. Now, you all did, who responded, you did choose a number between 1 and 10, but it was not done, strictly speaking, at random, because it was your brains, it was you making that choice. And when I play this little game in various parts of the world to in different geographical locations, to different age groups, it doesn't make any difference. It's always 7, which turns out to be the modal answer. And look at that, in sort of second and third place thereabouts, we've got sort of a 6 and 8, either side there of 7. And this goes to show the bias that people have towards 7 and, shall we say, higher numbers in the 1 to 10 case. Let me just close that poll window. So in matters of decision making involving people, you and I appreciate that biases always exist. Some of these biases are conscious, some of these are unconscious, and I'm sure many of you have perhaps been on various unconscious bias workshops potentially. So biases exist, and particularly for data sourced from people, there's always that caveat about can we trust our data? Do our data actually have integrity? So the LSE, like many universities, we have a motto. Ours is in Latin, and please forgive any poor Latin pronunciation. Rerum cognoscere causas. English translation, to understand the causes of things. Think of this, or I think of this at least, as really the mission statement of the LSE, what we were founded and set up to do way back in 1895. And so we had somewhat muted 125th birthday celebrations last year. So the thing about data and probability statistics is that it allows us to try and, I'm not saying it's easy to do, but to try and understand the causes of things. Such that in matters of data analytics, broadly, we may think about 2 main goals, 2 main objectives, one of which is the cognoscere, to understand what is driving a stock market, what is driving the spread of COVID-19 in a particular region. So understanding, but also we may wish to make predictions about the future. So, but before we can make predictions, we typically need a strong understanding. So knowing your audience is always perhaps a good piece of advice when delivering a presentation of any type, but especially so involving data. I'm going to make an assumption that many of you are working professionals, given the sort of the target audience for this talk. And so while data analytics is clearly not the exclusive preserve of the business arena, this offers at least one interesting application. Namely, and I am deliberately simplifying here, the purpose of data analytics to explore and discover new patterns, trends, and outliers. Well, let's take that word pattern or trends. I mean, not to take away from the public health crisis and the economic crisis of the pandemic, but purely from a sort of data perspective. I mean, I think we have all seen, wherever we are in the world, charts indicating the level of or number of COVID cases, or sadly COVID deaths in specific regions or countries around the world. And the pandemic has shown really sort of an unprecedented level of demand from sort of the mainstream news media for visualizations and the discussions about the best way of communicating potentially very vast data sets to a mass audience. So the demand for statistical sort of commentary has really been excessively high these past 12 months. And in particular, in matters of journalism, I think we're seeing much more in the way of data journalism. Just yesterday, in fact, I was listening as a listener to a webinar by The Economist and their data journalism team. Fascinating discussions there about how they source numerous data sets to produce their Economist articles. And a particular point they mentioned was that of outliers. Now, in sort of statistics 101, if anyone's taken statistics courses previously, thinking about defining an outlier and deciding what you should do with it. Should you exclude it from your data set, or should you keep it in? And The Economist very nicely touched on the outlier aspect, and they were saying that sometimes the outlier is the story, and it's that extreme observation that they want to report on. Whereas other times, outliers are somewhat distorting and distracting, and so one may make the case to remove them. But whether you retain an outlier or delete it, of course, one needs to, first of all, identify the existence of outliers and then investigate the reasons behind them, and hence whether we should keep them or exclude them. Now, how would we do that? And certainly on the skills front of this talk, we can make use of data visualization software, and I'll give you a little demo a little bit later on. So data is rich. It's there to be mined, and in matters of business, for example, but by no means exclusively for the business domain, discovering new markets, opportunities, but also optimizing and improving what we are currently doing, and very much trying to make predictions of the future. Just to come back to COVID momentarily, I think it was Monday last week that Boris Johnson, UK Prime Minister, was outlining the UK's sort of roadmap out of its the third lockdown. And he was saying that the government was going to be guided by data rather than dates. So there are provisional dates about when various restrictions will be relaxed, but they said very much it is a changing, a fluid environment, and they are going to be responsive to the latest data in terms of estimates of the current R value, number of cases, hospital admissions, etc. So even in the public sector, we're seeing very much, pleasingly, the use of data to drive decisions. And clearly, whether to lock down a population or not is perhaps one of the most serious decisions a government would have to contemplate. So in terms of the skills of presenting your results of a data analysis, I think there's this notion of storytelling. Now, I stress, if you read a storybook, are you reading a book of fiction, or are you reading a book of fact? So when I talk about sort of storytelling in terms of data visualization, I'm very much thinking of a story of fact. So various terms I'm sure you've heard bandied around in the media. I mentioned big data, data science, another one. So what is data science? Well, I'll inevitably simplify, but let's ignore the word data and think about science. So who undertakes science? A scientist. Now, when I was at school, I did my sort of biology, chemistry, physics. I did experiments in laboratories. I had my test tubes, Bunsen burners, pipettes, etc. And the idea was, through the conducting of experiments, to have a better understanding of whatever the experiment was about, but have a better understanding and be able to hopefully make some discoveries. Well, A data scientist is broadly doing the same thing, but maybe not with a laboratory, but rather with data and potentially quite powerful computers to make sense of it. So in terms of, I think, a critical skill for the post-COVID world is not so much just being able to do the analysis of the data, but to be able to communicate the results to the appropriate audience. Now, clearly, in matters of a pandemic, very concise, clear, simple communication was vital back in what sort of March 2020 in the UK to influence people's behaviour about having to stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives. So simplification of messaging is critical. Now, if let's say you're working in a business environment, if you're the one analysing the data, you are not necessarily the person who's the key decision maker. And it may be that part of your role is to persuade and convince the decision maker, guided by data and sort of data-driven and data-informed decision making, and being able to tell a very powerful and effective story. Now, perhaps post this event, you have a look at some of the latest COVID charts for your part of the world and think with a sort of critical eye, how effective are those charts at communicating the spread of the virus in that particular region? What sort of scale is being used, linear or a logarithmic scale, which is appropriate? What variables are being plotted? Are we interested in cases? Are we interested in deaths? Are we looking at raw numbers? Are we looking at controlling for population? And just slight tweaks to settings in your visualization can potentially convey very different messages. So clearly there's scope for, shall we say, abuse of data and statistics, such that if you are consuming the results of others, please do so with a healthy degree of skepticism and look very closely about how the charts or data are presented, and to make sure that there are no sort of ulterior motives trying to be presented. Now, data. Be afraid, be very afraid. Credits to Google here for the source of the data. The Vix Index, known as sort of Wall Street sort of fear gauge or fear index, a measure about just how worried investors, financial markets are. So this is, as you can see, from a year ago, as the pandemic was really starting to spread globally. And you can see throughout March how the VIX increased dramatically to just over sort of a level of 80. Now, a number by itself is meaningless. You must always have some benchmark for comparison. So I think the appropriate benchmark would be sort of the pre-COVID era, and in very early 2020 into back into 2019, the Vix Index tended to be around about 20 or 30 or so, and you could see the dramatic increase in fear due to perhaps arguably unprecedented uncertainty that the world faced. And clearly this is not specific to concern in financial markets about how we've never really experienced a global pandemic of this magnitude in more recent history. Yet very quickly, in a matter of weeks into April 2020, you could see a dissipation of that VIX index. So we're seeing now decisions, pretty major decisions of your central banks, US Federal Reserve, for example, trying to steady the ship, steady markets. And there was a fairly quick dissipation in the VIX. I mean, think about yourselves. As and when, wherever you are in the world, when you went into lockdown, you probably had your own estimate back in March, April about how long you would be under lockdown arrangements. For myself, I was thinking maybe, perhaps naively, well, really naively now, maybe 3 or 6 months and things will be broadly back to normal. Well, here we are about a year later, and still UK currently in lockdown. But a great benefit of data, and I don't think this could be stressed enough, is the ability, done well, to sort of reduce the perception reality gap which exists in all aspects of life, such that when we make decisions, we tend to make it often based on gut instinct or our personal, based on our personal world view. And clearly our world views will no doubt deviate substantially. Now, decisions based on perception are not necessarily leading to good decisions. It's better that decisions are based on reality. So done well and with good quality data, and making data-driven or data-informed decisions, there is tremendous potential for us to sort of reduce this perception-reality gap. So just for where we are now, this is the full history of the Vix Index. And interestingly, look at that. In the global financial crisis, 2008-9-ish, you can see the peak fear was greater than the peak fear from the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, personally, I was very surprised to see that. I mean, global financial crisis was bad, but I think the impact, global impact of the pandemic has been far, far worse. Now, this is a simple time series chart of a single variable, yet we can see that the reality from the Vix index seems to differ greatly from perhaps what our perceptions might have been. Now, whether that's to say this was misplaced fear or maybe an underestimate of the scale of the pandemic in March 2020, I mean, I'll leave that as an open question. So we heard, particularly in the media, in the early stages of the pandemic, about different letters of the alphabet to talk about the shape of the economic recovery. And again, data has really come to the fore, such that in previous years, we may have to rely on the somewhat lagging macroeconomic statistics of GDP figures, unemployment, etc. But now with things like Google in sort of real time, we can look at restaurant bookings, footfall on the high street, unemployment benefit claimant counts, etc. And the sort of velocity with which new data are being collected allows us to perhaps update our beliefs in a quicker time frame. Now, this list of letters of the alphabet have clearly expanded in over recent months. There was a lot of talk initially about the V-shaped recovery. So the idea being the letter V, a sharp contraction and then a quick rebound. Then it was suggested maybe U, L, W. I think more recently, this K-shaped recovery, winners and losers, and arguably in any sort of crisis catastrophe, there typically are winners and losers. We could perhaps debate the ratio of them, but they exist. So in terms of skills for a post-COVID world, I suppose you would wish to be in the winner camp rather than the loser camp, and the demand for people who can make sense of data, I think it really exceeds the supply of such individuals, and hence it would be a very sensible decision for you to undertake to expand your quantitative skills. Now, of those on this session, I would anticipate great variability in what those sort of prior level of skills are, but just some sort of food for thought about if you wished to develop these sorts of skill sets, what might be maybe the top 5 or so areas, at least as a starting point to consider. Well, I guess first of all, sort of a mindset, in that appreciate that we do live in this world of uncertainty, and clearly a very heightened uncertainty of as highlighted by the pandemic. And to appreciate that the future is not certain. And when you see forecasts, projections for COVID transmission based on the different rates of the vaccine rollout around the world, to treat these forecasts or projections as precisely that, not a statement of fact about what will happen, but based on our best assessment, looking at the most recently available data about what we think may happen. So really an awareness and an appreciation for uncertainty. Number 2, data visualization and descriptive statistics. I love this theme. Now, let me, just switch window. So An example of data visualization software is just one that I use myself, Tableau, but I mean other software available. But the power of data visualization to communicate potentially vast quantities of data very quickly and efficiently. So let's take your climate change as an example. And I think Bill Gates recently was saying that for humanity to solve the current pandemic is a tough task, but to solve the challenge of climate change, he considered to be even greater. So decision makings about curbing CO2 emissions, on what basis might governments, and I think really it's the politicians to be convinced, to undertake the right kind of environmental policies. So just to give an example, not going into heavy detail on the construction of these visualizations, but note the simple use of color to convey your orders of magnitude. And note here, we've got data and credits to Tableau for the production of this visualization, going from around about 1850 to the early 2000s. So over 150 years of data. So it's taken a century and a half just to collect this information. Yet in one visualization, or one dashboard here, combined of two visualizations, in fact, we can convey or communicate to an audience a very useful picture about how the world's temperature is changing. And if I may, let's just go to sort out the scatter plot. Remember I was saying about data science, identifying trends, patterns, your relationships, outliers. Well, what is the trend? Clearly those points are not perfectly along a line. There's some noise here. And suppose we wished to filter out the signal from the noise. Well, easily done. And just a simple drag and drop of the mouse, we can think about applying, let's say, a trend line. Perhaps the simplest analytically to work with is a linear trend. And many people, perhaps mathematically, it's easier to work with linear equations than nonlinear equations. But is the world truly linear? I would suggest not, broadly it's non-linear. But you can see an increasing trend. I feel that trend line, it conveys a message that the difference from the median temperature in the 1961 to 1990 range. I mean, the trend is upwards. Perhaps, though, this is not the best fitting trend line. Let's take a sort of more polynomial approach. Aha. And I think to the casual observer, this clearly offers a better fit to the data, and perhaps nicely conveys, if we look at the accelerating rate of change, that increasing, yes, but what in the last 50 or so years that we've seen a more dramatic, more significant increase in temperature. Now, okay, perhaps the world's climate has always been changing and forever will, but it's looking at the rate of this change, which of course is causing alarm among climate scientists. Let's take economic example. Okay, perhaps very historic data here, but inflation. Gosh, I mean, I've been reading many news reports recently about concerns about inflation. We're seeing massive, fiscal and monetary stimulus by governments around the world. I mean, there was a lot of that to combat the financial crisis barely 10 years ago. And really, had the world's macroeconomic environment, had it truly sort of normalized following the financial crisis, interest rates were starting to go up a little bit, but were still at historically quite low levels. Then, barely 10 years later, you have a massive global pandemic, and then suddenly your monetary policy tool is somewhat, or the ammunition of that has somewhat diminished. So there are potential fears about inflation in the years ahead. Now, through again 70, 80 years or so of data on screen here, done well, a simple visualization is good at telling a story. Clearly, the deflationary spiral as a consequence of the Great Depression. You've got your sort of your oil price crises of the 1970s, a more sort of benign inflationary environment more recently, but will that trend continue? So some simple examples of the data visualization. So just to come back here. And the great thing about data visualization, I think anyone can do it, having, of course, the data and the software to do so, but the construction of data visualizations, I mean, within about an hour or two, even as a novice user of software, I think you can be creating some very informative and engaging visualizations quite quickly. And again, I offer up the examples of the numerous COVID charts we've seen in the past year. So I think that is a great skill, albeit with a caveat that data visualization is more of a descriptive exercise. It's describing or perhaps identifying a trend or a pattern. But now we come back to the rerum cognoscere causas, understand the causes of things, what's driving those particular trends. So the increase in global temperature, is it due to human economic activity? Number three, quantifying risk through probability. So as a statistician, we use probabilities to quantify uncertainty, but mentioning the V's of big data, one of them, the velocity, the speed of collecting new data, and the importance of being able to use the latest available data to update our beliefs about the world. Again, Boris Johnson's announcement from last Monday, he set out, which was what, 13 or so, no, 10, 11 days ago. Oh, my mental arithmetic's terrible. Boris Johnson made his announcement then and gave target dates for certain different levels of relaxation of restrictions. But he said this will be guided by, they will be guided by data and not dates. And depending on things like the vaccine rollout, any new mutant variants of COVID-19, and how effective are the vaccines against those, and are people still observing social distancing, etc., etc. And as new data comes to light, it's only right and proper in a sort of Bayesian way that decisions are or our view of the world is updated in light of the most recent information. Things change, trends change. Then you saw in the climate change case there, perhaps an increasing trend in the 19th century, but at quite a low rate of increase, and accelerated more, let's say, in the last 50 years. Data integrity. Can you trust your data? Particularly, I mean, we are the London School of Economics and political science. Many people forget that little addendum. So if we were to look at, let's say, political opinion polling, we take the US presidential election of November 2020. Okay, the pollsters, I think, broadly got it right in terms of predicting Joe Biden would win, but I think the margin of his victory, that was sort of overestimated. And perhaps the pollsters hopefully have learnt lessons of failing to predict the outcome in 2016, and they had hoped to be more accurate in their 2020 polls. And it just goes to show that when you're collecting data from people, I come back to the pick a number at random between 1 and 10, there are always potentials for biases in data collected from individuals. And so being, first of all, aware and conscious of biases which can exist in data is the starting point. And then, of course, trying, perhaps easier said than done, to remove those biases from data sets. Now, on that presidential election example, clearly tended to overrepresent perhaps more Democrat-leaning voters, underrepresenting Republican-leaning voters, and on various demographic characteristics, such that I think the pollsters were trying to adjust for over and underrepresentation, but as we see from sort of the eventual votes tally, and like states like Florida was predicted to go blue and it went red. So clearly is easier said than done to get a truly sort of representative sample. Final point, and I want to get to the Q&A. evidence-based decisions. And I am hopeful, I consider myself broadly an optimist, that going forward, we will see more data-driven decision-making, whether it's in the private sector, whether it's in the public sector, and very much in the public sector. I'd like to see government policy in any part of the world driven more by the reality from reliable data than politicians making decisions based on their sort of perceptions. And remember, there's often a vast gulf between perception and reality. Now, I appreciate it takes time, depending on your prior level of quantitative skills. It does take some investment of time and effort to develop these. And of course, there are always opportunity costs. Each of us faces the same dilemma. We have 24 hours in a day. There's a limit to what we can do, and we've got to decide where to allocate our time and effort. But I think the sort of cost-benefit analysis, the benefit of you being able to analyze data, make sense of it, and assist with better decision making will typically outweigh the more negligible costs in terms of the time aspect of acquiring those skills. So, in a very British way, I should say that please do keep calm and analyze your data. And if you do so, I do not promise you success. I will not give you that cast iron guarantee, but I'm looking about trying to increase your probability of success. So that concludes my 2 or 3 cents. And I believe Russell has appeared. Hello, Russell.
Hello, James. And I can confirm you did promise me before we started the session that everyone would vote, or the most popular answer would be 7. So yes. I'm impressed.
Thank you. Well, people are, because it was people answering that question, and people are, the irrationality of people and having that sort of bias towards 7, that for me was completely predictable, having done that experiment many times.
Oh, it certainly was true here. Well, you said it yourself, data has come to the fore over the last year. So as you can imagine, there's been a number of questions in the Q&A relating to COVID and the last year. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with some of the broader questions first, and then we'll kind of wrap up with perhaps a quick fire round, I think, around okay. COVID. So the first question that's the most popular one that's been upvoted is from Florian, who is sort of asks, beyond storytelling, is there kind of evidence or studies about what types of visualization are the most effective to transmit certain types of information? So I guess, what do you think about when you're choosing your visualizations?
Great question. And I think I'll answer it, if I may, with saying that data visualization, or data viz for short, to use the lexicon, it's really an art as much as it is a science. And there's not necessarily a single right way of presenting data. Clearly, depending on the number of variables and the type of data you have, clearly some visualizations will be preferable to others. But it does require a bit of trial and error. And I will come back to those COVID charts. I mean, they have evolved over the last 12 months. And what's the best metric to judge the state of COVID in a particular country? Is it cases? Well, that's going to depend on testing regimes, and they'll be highly variable around the world. Is it deaths? Perhaps it's a very macabre concept, but is perhaps the most objective measure is that of excess deaths, which means deaths above an average, let's say the historical average for the last 5 years. Now, those excess deaths are not necessarily all directly due to COVID, but it's deaths that we could perhaps attribute to COVID, e.g. hospitals too busy dealing with COVID cases to treat other conditions. So it's not easy. And it will require trial and error. It's knowing your audience, what sort of level of technical expertise are they likely to have. I think the use of color is very helpful, but be conscious of color blindness, through red-green color blindness. Tableau is aware of that, and the default color setting avoids the red-green. So, well, the classic LSE answer, it depends on the choice.
Brilliant, thanks. And then actually a question from Therese, who's asked, sort of practically, what are the skills that somebody would need to perform data analytics, perhaps particularly she's interested in a digitized business. But if you're looking for a career in this field, what would you say are the key skills?
Well, okay, in my short talk today, it was perhaps more of a focus on the data viz side. Clearly, that is your one aspect, by no means the only one in to be a data analyst. And I suppose it depends on which sort of area one wishes to specialize in. The nice thing about data visualization is that they say a picture speaks, sorry, a story, whatever it is, a picture speaks 1,000 words. A data visualization speaks 1,000 data points or more. Depends what you're trying to achieve. Is it describing the data? And I think that's an excellent starting point. And I don't claim that should necessarily be the end of an empirical investigation, but you want to highlight interesting areas to deep dive further. So if you were to go more into the modeling, I mean, come back to COVID, it's of course very topical, trying to model the transmission of the virus in a country, and the various epidemiologists out there, they'll have their various models and all of the assumptions attached to them, and I'm sure there'll be disagreement about the validity of those assumptions. But if you wanted to get more into the modeling side, then clearly putting in time and effort to develop your programming skills, things like R, Python would be natural starting points. So yeah, you'll never be an expert in everything, and it's perhaps trying to experiment a bit, see what appeals to you, and then refine the skills in that particular area. But I think it's good to have a sort of breadth as well as depth.
Right. Well, you've answered both questions by talking about COVID, so we will get to the COVID questions. But
I'm sorry.
Before we do, I will. There's another popular question that's coming from Janice. So let's see if you can help us set the story straight on this. So you talked about data science, but what's the difference in a couple of sentences between data analysis, and data science?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I mean, some people may use those terms interchangeably. Is that fair to do so? I would say perhaps the data science is a bit more on the technical side, perhaps looking at your database infrastructure, more sort of the programming side to develop your algorithms. Maybe a data analyst is a bit, I won't say superficial, but looking more at maybe the customer facing or the consumer facing side, perhaps more on presenting the results of the analysis. Now, I feel, both have their strengths, but it's perhaps good to have an appreciation of the technical side and the communication side. You can do the most wonderful analysis, but if you can't persuade people, the key decision makers to make decisions based on your findings, and this would have been a complete waste of time. So I would always stress the importance of strong communication skills, for which data visualization, I think, is a great way and a very efficient way of communicating. 150 years of climate data. Well, I didn't collect it, but in just one dashboard, you get a sense very clearly about where things are headed with regards to climate. So broadly, I would say more the data analyst, business analyst, perhaps a bit more on the reporting side, the description side, and the data science side a bit more on the techie.
Right, there we go. So that was really helpful. Hope that answered the question. Now, Hannah has, let's get on to the COVID questions. And let's start with one that Hannah has asked, which is perhaps a nice broad one to start with. And that's an opinion one for you, really. But she asks, do you think it's a good trend that more people are becoming interested in looking at graphs during COVID-19 and engaging with data themselves, perhaps? Or are you more worried about the risk of I guess, people doing this and misinterpreting things and without having perhaps the skills to do it?
Well, I think it's always good to motivate and see people's interest and engagement. Of course, there is the risk that people misinterpret things, and hence that's why it falls to education. Education is to instruct people properly in the interpretation. What is the difference between a linear scale and a logarithmic scale? And indeed, I think perhaps academics creating these COVID charts with a logarithmic scale, no doubt very versatile in what logarithm means. But I think for the general public, are they probably interpreting those charts? But I mean, that's really a matter of education. It's great to see the the stimulation of interest in data. And clearly, I'm sure people's personal interest will go beyond just COVID, but the nature of the variables you're plotting, I mean, that's just domain specific, but the usefulness of the data viz, I think, is that's the key point.
So first, actually, that's interesting because Rachel's asked quite a popular question as well, which is when and why do you use log?
Well, I mean, because of the COVID-19 virus, I mean, I'm no sort of virologist, but you've got the exponential growth of cases there. Okay? And I'm sure you've all heard about the R number and the estimates of the R number. And to know the R number itself is easier said than done. And the estimates are a lot of uncertainty, confidence intervals attached to those estimates. So in order to if you think about, I'll take the UK as being based here for the last year, is that in the very early days, February, March, the number of cases was in absolute numbers pretty small, and then you saw this dramatic increase, and it's about trying to fit, shall we say, the data in a suitable way, given the stylized facts of the variable you're plotting. So because it's a sort of exponential growth, you've got R of 2, so one person infects two others on average, and then very quickly that's going to compound, and it's the logarithm of that is the more useful way of conveying the data. But I mean, some Johns Hopkins University being synonymous with collecting COVID data, and I've seen, for example, the Financial Times has done a great use of their data journalism team, and that's been evolving over time and over the last year about what's being plotted, and is it not just log versus linear, but raw cases or cases per 100,000 or per million. And I think it's like an aggregate versus a mean, and I think that's one of the simplest stats you would cover in stats 101, and I think an average is perhaps more informative than an aggregate, but of course other people may disagree. So there may not be consensus on how to approach it, but you would take your view, and then this comes back to the communication skills and the powers of persuasion, and to argue your case about why you feel your choice of visualization is the most effective.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks, James. And I guess another sort of big theme in the pandemic, which is highlighted by Bill, who's in New York, is around ethics in data presentation. So I guess perhaps thinking, I mean, comments on it on COVID, but I guess also for us thinking about it as managers, what sort of things should we be thinking about from an ethical perspective when we're using data?
Well, I mean, I guess we could take this in various dimensions. I mean, in terms of just reporting a chart, I mean, clearly citing your source of your data. I mean, I think in some of my cases, it was an oral citation rather than written. And data integrity, can you trust your data? Is the data from a reputable source or a less reputable one? But I think also on the ethics front, and this is where I think the legal profession, and I think there's, are the laws of the land more equipped for the analog age or the digital age? We've got things like GDPR, blah, blah, blah. But I think there's scope to ensure that people's privacy concerns about to what extent do they want to be monitored, and perhaps that's a debate to be had among the general public. And I guess it would fall down to like a cost-benefit analysis. If I give up some private information about me, that's a cost. What benefit do I get in return, and does the benefit justify the cost? So I think the ethics side, is a major topic to consider, and I think laws in various countries over time, I think, need to be updated for the digital era.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's almost a whole session in itself probably on ethics and data. So again, interesting question from VJ, who I assume, based on what he's asked about, must be in the UK. So he's asked a question about using data. I guess when you should and shouldn't use data, I think, is behind his question. His example is which we might need to explain for our international viewers, is the exam algorithm which was used to decide A-level results, or to inform how A-level results were allocated to students in the UK, secondary school students last summer. And so how does data and data analysis need to fit with its context? And perhaps is there a time when we try and go to data too much?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll again, for the benefit of our international audience. So, examinations or in-person examinations were at school level were cancelled in the UK last year. I suspect in other countries too. So, but students still need a qualification. They need a grade. So, if there's no exam script, how do you get the grade? So, broadly, the algorithm was looking about trying to predict what the algorithm thought these particular students were going to get in terms of their grade. Now, I mentioned bias in sort of various capacities, and it seems that the algorithm didn't sufficiently take into account a whole host of parameters. I don't want to go into the technical sort of details now. So it still needs some human insight. And while with the rise of machine learning and AI, I mean, computers are good, but for the time being, I still think there needs to be a sense check, which for now I don't think the computers can provide, and we still need that human input. And as soon as those predicted official grades got released, there was a huge political storm, and it arose very quickly when many students felt hard done by that their predicted grade fell well short of what they thought they deserved. So those biases, it was unfortunate that these weren't picked up before the publication of those results. So bias, I mean, creeps in all sorts of places, and always be aware or be on the lookout for it. So I think for the foreseeable future, e.g. our career lifespans, I think there's still going to be a significant need, even if we defer a lot of the number crunching to the computers, that the need for a sense check, a reality check. Does it seem reasonable? Does it seem plausible? That itself doesn't guarantee what you predicted is going to be right or close to right, but you can usually pick out or identify when things are really off. So skills for a post-COVID world, the human skills of making sense of the data, and does it make sense?
And that is a great practical tip on which to end our session. Thank you to everybody for your questions. Thank you so much to James for your time. And thank you very much for everyone for joining us today. Thank you to you all for how many of these sessions you've joined. We hope you've enjoyed them and found them insightful. And you can find out more about our online certificate course, Data Analysis for Management, led by James.
I hear it's good. I hear it's really good. But I'm biased.
You are biased, which helps you develop the skills you need to communicate data with confidence, as well as our entire portfolio of online courses via the link which is on the slide right now. You can also find out what other online events are happening throughout the rest of term by going to the LSE events website. If you would like to catch up on any of the sessions from this week or share them with a friend or colleague, then you can find them on the LSE Festival Hub webpage and on the LSE player. We'll also be writing up summaries of all the key takeaways from each of the 5 Skills for a Post-COVID World series that we've done this week. So keep an eye out on our social media channels for those. We hope to have them available in a few weeks' time. Thank you once again to everyone for joining us. Thank you so much for your engagement and your questions. Goodbye for now. Have a great day.
Stay safe, stay healthy.